Going to start today's daf yomi on the bottom of Bays Bays 2b. We're going to start around 7 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is saying that Rav Papa had said, the Gemara first had asked the question, the avos, it says in our Mishnah that there are 4 avos of Nezikin. And since it says that there are 4 primary categories of damages, the Gemara says, but from the fact that it says avos, that means that there are 2 others, that there are subcategories. And since it says that, since the implications that there are subcategories, the Gemara wants to know if these subcategories are like the subcategories of Shabbos, in which the subcategories of Tolados on Shabbos have the same halacha as the Avos, or the subcategories are like the subcategories of Tumah, where they're completely different laws as it relates to the subcategories of Tumah. In this context, the Gemara says, the Rav Papa says, Yeshman kayotzibem, Yeshman alav kayotzibem. There are certain subcategories which have the same halachas as the avos, and there are certain tolados which have different halachos as the primary categories. So the Gemara wants to know, what is the example of the tolados saying lav kayotze ben? What's the example where the subcategories are not the same as the avos? And the Gemara is first trying to attack it by saying that maybe it relates to one of the categories of ox. The Gemara listed 4 primary categories of damages, and the first is a shore, but shore itself can be subdivided into 3 categories, which are all primary avos. They're all primary categories which come from an ox. What is that? That is a karen, shein, v'regel, a goring, a tooth, and a foot. And so the Gemara is saying maybe it's one of these categories. We already dismissed that it's not goring. So therefore, the Gemara says, aha, if you want to say it refers to goring, maishna karen, why would it be referring to the subcategories of goring, which we said are like pushing or kicking of the ox? That this is really the same thing. Maishna hani, why is this any different? Maishna karen, the kavanah hazik, goring, it's intended to do damage, and yet it's your money and you're supposed to watch it. Hani nami, also if the animal would kick, kavanah hazik, then its intent is to do damage, and your money and you're supposed to watch it. Ela tolada the karen kikaren. So it must be that that's not what Rav Papa is referring to, because we're saying the subcategory of goring is exactly like goring. Rav Papa, when Rav Papa says that the subcategories are the same as the primary categories, maybe that's not referring to the goring of the ox, but maybe it's referring to other damage that the ox does, i.e. the subcategories of shein, of tooth, the regel, or foot. So now we're 3 lines from the bottom on Beis and Beis. So the Gemara says, well, let's see. Shein v'regel hechiksivi. First, we have to establish that tooth and foot are indeed primary categories that are written in the Torah. Where is that the case? Titania, we learned in the Brisa. How do we know that it's written in the Torah? It says v'shilach. It says in the pasuk that if a person will make a fire in his field, v'shilach es be'iro, and he will send it off into the other field. V'shilach, this refers to regel. That refers to foot, says the Talmud, where you're walking in it, where the ox walks in another field. V'cheinu omer mishlachei regel ashor v'chamor ubi. And so therefore, shilach is referring to tooth. So therefore, we know that shilach is referring to foot. So therefore, we know that foot is the primary category. And ubir zu hashein. This is a reference to tooth. V'cheinu omer kasher yivaer agalal atumo. This is the pasuk from Malachim, and it's referencing to consumption. That's how Rashi explains it. So therefore, we see from here that this is this was the words of Achia the Navi about Malchus Yeravam. He says I will destroy Yeravam, the house of Yeravam, just like one consumes something. And so we see from here that shein and regel are both written in the Torah. Amar Mar. So first, let's analyze, before the Gemara is going to get into the tolados of shein, the Gemara first has to analyze the statement. Amar Mar v'shilach du regel. Is this really the case? V'cheinu omer. So it states mishlachei regel ashor v'chamor. It says that it says v'cheinu omer mishlachei regel v'ashor v'chamor. Taima. How do we know that v'shilach is foot? Because the cause of Rachmana mishlachei regel ashor v'chamor. If it were not the case, if that were not the case, but my mukul itzla, what would we say that this verse of Vashilach is referring to? Well, it could be referring ikaren ksiv. If it would be say it's referring to goring, goring was already written in the Torah, because we this kiyigach is a reference to goring. And each shein, if you want to say it's referring to tooth, ksiv, that's also written in the Torah. So where, of course, we don't need to have a proof to tell us that B'shilach is a reference to foot from that pasuk in Malachim. Excuse me, from the pasuk in in Yeshaya, where it says Mishalchei Regel Ashor V'Chamor, because otherwise, what else could it be referring to? The Gemara says, no, I'll tell you what else it could be referring to. It's Salkadai Chamina. You might have thought it's a reference to Idi v'Idi Ashen. You might have thought it's a reference to that they're both psukim are referring to tooth, both the pasuk. Both the word Yivaer and the pasuk of Shilach is referring to tooth, and there are two different types of damage done by the animal with tooth. One is where the animal eats it completely, and one is where the animal eats it but doesn't destroy it. Like, for example, eats half of it, or eats it and then spits it out. So they're both. We might have thought it's both referring to both types of damage done by eating. The Gemara says, "Kamashma." So therefore, we see from here that one pasuk is referring to foot and one is referring to tooth. Regel. So the Gemara says, "Okay, we're going to say it's a reference to the tooth." Excuse me. Now that we've established it's a reference to foot, Shane and how do we know that if there's a tooth, that if an animal does damage with the tooth, but it doesn't completely consume the food, how do we know that that's also considered a primary source of damage? The Gemara says, "Dumya de regel," because it has to be similar to a foot. Just like when the animal tramples on something, we don't care if it's completely destroyed or not, it's still going to be considered damages. So to tooth, it doesn't matter if it's completely consumed, we're going to say it's the damage of the tooth. And now the Gemara it tries to explain the other pasuk. We said ubier. Then it says uvier is a reference to the tooth, zu ashen. And we have the pasuk from Malachim that says about Yeravam, so too it will become completely destroyed. So why do we need the pasuk from Malachim? Asks the Gemara. Time in the cost of Rachmana kasher yivayer hagalal tumo. We're not for that pasuk, but Mayo Kimnula. What would we say the pasuk is referring to? Ikar, and if you want to say it's a reference to goring, ksiv. Goring is explicitly written in the Torah. Yigach iragel. If you want to say it's a reference to foot, that's also written. Shilach. So therefore, Isaac have a good time teaching. So therefore, Itzrach, we might have thought Salkadai Techamina. You might have thought Idi v'Idi Aragel. You might have thought that both psukim, Hubiar and Vishilach, are both a reference to foot. You might have thought Idi v'Idi Aragel Hada Azal Mamela Hada Shalach Suche. That there are two types of damages by foot. One is where the animal goes on its own, and one is where the animal is sent. Kamash Malan. Now we're saying that no, one of the verses is a reference to foot, and that is the shilach, and the other is a reference to eating kasher uvier. So the Gemara says v'hashad uki ashein. Well, now that we say the pasuk of uvier is a reference to tooth, regel to azlam and meal. We know, and how do we know that if the animal goes on its own and tramples in another field, that's a primary source of damage that you're responsible for? Gemara says, I'll tell you how we know it, because it's dumya deshain. Because it obviously has to be similar to the characteristics of tooth. Ma shein lo shna shelcha shluchei lo shna da azam amela. Just like by tooth, we don't distinguish whether the animal was sent to the other person's field to eat or it went on its own. In either case, you're responsible. So too, afraga lo shna shelcha shluchei lo shna azam amela. So too, by foot, we don't care if it was sent or if it walked on its own. So then the Gemara asks another question. V'lichtov rachmana vishileach. Let the Torah just tell us the concept of the verb vishilach, that you send that you send the fire, vishilach, you send the fire into the other person's field. V'lo ba'u bir, and we don't need to say that you destroy the other field, and therefore we would be able to know that Dimash, or the word vishilach, could imply actually not only foot, but also tooth. To mashma regel, mashma shein. It can apply both. Mashma regel, they'll say, we know it can apply foot because we say mish l'chei regel ashor v'chamor. We already had that pasuk from Isaiah, which says that it's a reference to the mishalchei regel ashor v'chamor, that it's a reference to foot. And we know it could also be tooth because it says mashma shein, they'll say v'shein beimos ashalech bam. It says the tooth of animals I will send upon you. This is a pasuk from Devarim, from the end of Devarim. So if that's the case, So if that's the case, from Kisaro, so if that's the case, why do we need both psukim? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. We're not for the extra pasuk. Havamina, oha, oha. We're not for the extra pasuk. We would say that pasuk of the shilach is either a reference to foot or tooth. Oh, regal dezeko mod. So either foot because it's very common that the animal just tramples. Oh, shane the yesha no azika, or tooth because the animal gets a benefit. So michte shkunin, since we could either apply it to one or to the other. Ask the Gemara v'yavo shnein d'haim and mafkad, and since we could apply it to other one, we wouldn't know which one to exclude. So therefore, it's we need the two psukim. Oh, excuse me. The Gemara is now asking a question. Michte shkunim v'yavo shneim d'haim and mafkad. So the Gemara says, well, since it could apply to either one, then we should apply it to both, because which one will we think to exclude? So the Gemara says, no, it's you needed to have the extra pasuk, because I might have said that you apply it to both only where it was sent. But if it walked on its own, we wouldn't think to apply it. Kamash, and therefore we apply it to both. Gemara says, why do we think that there is? So we're still trying to answer Rav Papa's question. We're still trying to explain Rav Papa's statement. Rav Papa had said that there are some of the tolados of damages are like their avos, are like the primary categories, and some are not. So we said, what are the ones that are not according to Rav Papa? We tried to say that it was goring of the ox, and the ox can be divided into three categories. The three primary categories: goring, which is karen, shane, and regal, goring, foot, and tooth. So now we've established it wasn't goring because the tolada of goring is exactly like the ox. And now we established that the subcategories or the main categories of ox, two of them are tooth and foot. So maybe it's a tolada of tooth. Maybe it's a tolada of tooth is different than the av of tooth. So the Gemara first asks the question: tolada de shein mai. What is the subcategory of tooth? So the Gemara says the subcategory of tooth is maybe maybe it's a case where the animal is trying to get benefit. He has an itch, so it rubs against the wall for its benefit. Or vitinfa peros, or if the animal rolls down on produce for its own benefit. So therefore, maybe that's the case where the subcategory is different. The Gemara says, why would that subcategory be different? Why would that case be different? Why is that different than tooth? A tooth has the animal has benefit by eating it. And you're responsible. It's your money. You're responsible. Haninami. Also, if the animal rubs against the wall and does damage, and you're responsible for it. So the Gemara says the subcategory of tooth is kashain. It's the same law as shane. Rav Papa says that there are some that are different than there are some tolados that are different than the avos. It must be referring to regel, to foot. So the Gemara says, no, it can't be. Tolado the regel mayi. What's the subcategory of foot? It is a zeka begufa. This is where the animal does damage, let's say, with its body. Derech hilucha, while walking. It's walking along the road and like a bull in a china shop and knocks things over. Or bisara, or with its hair, it sticks to something. Derech hilucha. Or bishliv shalal, or with its blanket. Or biprumia, or with a bit in its mouth. Or bezut shebet savara, or with a bell in its neck. So the Gemara says, no. Why would that case be any different law than the foot itself? Why would that be different in the case of foot, which is the zeka matzoi, that the damage is readily available and it's your responsibility. Aninami as zika matzoi, that this is also common damage. So therefore, we're going to say that tolada of regel, the subcategory of foot, is exactly like foot. Tolada de regel regel. Rav Papa, tolada de bor. Now we're going to say Rav Papa's statement that the tolados are not like the avos. That goes to a second category listed in the Mishnah. The second, number 2, ashora bora mavevaha hever. And what's the second category? Is pit. It's a subcategory of pit. If you have a dangerous pit in the public domain, causes damage, you're responsible. So the Gemara says, that there maybe Rav Papa's statement is referring to the subcategory of pit, that's not the same as pit. The Gemara says, well, Tolada Debor Main Ihil. What would be a subcategory of pit? If you want to say that the primary category of a pit that does damage is Av, is Yud, the primary category is if the pit is 10 tefachim deep, pit is 4 inches. Each tefach is 4 inches, approximately 40 inches deep. Vitolada, and the subcategory of it is 10, is 9. That Yuksivi, 9 is not written in the Torah, and not 10 is not written in the Torah. So why would we say that only 10 is the Av and 9 is not? So the Gemara says, well, halo kasha. That's not difficult because we could say Amesielo. It says in the pasuk that if you have a pit, that you have to pay for the animal if it dies, and you get to keep the carcass. And Amar Achman of Akimul Rabbanan, and the rabbis understand Yud that if it's 10 tefacham deep, avdan mis, so that kills it. Test nizikin avdi misalo avdi. That if it's 9, it just does damages but doesn't kill it. So therefore, maybe it's a subcategory. Gemara says it doesn't matter. So even if it's only 9, zav misa. If it's 10, we could say it's a primary category for killing it. V'zav nizikin. If it's 9, it's a primary category for doing damages. So therefore, the Gemara says it must be what's a subcategory of pit. Ela avno sakino maso. It's a reference to the stone. Or if you leave a stone in the public domain, umaso, if you leave your object in the public domain, shenicham rishus aram, you left them in the public domain, viziko, and it did the damage. That's what it must be a reference to. So there we're going to say that that's a subcategory. Well, the Gemara says, hey, chidami, what are we talking about? Idaf karinu, if you say this is not my stone, or this is not my object, and I'm just abandoning it here in the public domain, this, whether it's according to Rav or whether according to Shmuel, they argue about this in Hamayniach Hasakat, in the chapter on Daf Chav Ches Beis, that they're going to say that this, according to both, this is going to be considered a pit. Hainu bor, this is a pit, because both say any mishap that ensues from something you declared onerous is going to be learned out from a pit, and you're going to be liable, just like you're liable for a pit in the public domain, which is onerous. So if that's the case, that you took this object of yours and you declared it onerous, it's exactly the same as the pit. So why would you think a Torah of bor is any different? But let's say we're talking about a case where it's still yours, that you left your pitcher there in the pit, and you didn't declare it onerous. Either Shmuel, the Amar Kula Miboroman. Shmuel says Hainu Bor. Shmuel says that this is a pit, and according to Rav, who says that if you don't declare it onerous, we learn out from ox Mishar Lamanu Hainu. Sure, then it's exactly the same as an ox. Ma'ishna Bor. Why is it different than a pitch? It came Tchilas Asiyaso a Nezek that was made to do damage. Umimoncho Shmiras Olecha, and you're responsible for it. This too, also this case of this ox, this case of your burden that you left in the public domain, it was made to do damage. Meaning to say, when you left it in the pit, it was a damaging thing, and you're responsible for it. So therefore, we have to say, the derivative, the subcategory of pit, is exactly the same as pit. When Rav Papa says that there are some subcategories that are not like the primary categories, what's he referring to? He's referring to the Tawada de Maveh. He's referring to the subcategories of Maveh. What's Maveh? Now the Gemara is going to say, well, Maveh Ma'niya, what is? Gemara is saying, what are the subcategories of Maveh? Before we can understand what the subcategories of Maveh are, we have to know what's the primary category of Maveh. Shmuel, if you want to say according to Shmuel, the Mav Hazu Shein. Shmuel says that the third primary Av in the Mishnah, which is, we go Shor Bor Maveh. Shmuel says it's tooth. We've already established that the subcategories of tooth are exactly like tooth. And if you want to say according to Rav, who says Maveh is the damage done by a human being, well, if that's the case, my avos, my tolados ispay. What primary categories and what tolados are there by a human? Every damage that the human does is going to be considered a primary category. And if you want to say that the primary category is Neyor is when the human is awake, and Tolada and the subcategory is when the human is sleeping. Tolada Yashain. If a person does damage while he's sleeping, maybe that's considered to be a subcategory of damage and not the primary damage. It can't be because what now we're going to learn in the Mishnah on Daf Chavav. Adam Olam. A person is always responsible for the damage he does. Bein air, bein yashan, whether he's awake or whether he's sleeping. So it can't be that the person is that a subcategory of the damage of a human is while he's sleeping. So that can't be the case. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe what the Gemara is saying is what's a subcategory of the damage is done by a human? It's ela kicho v'neo. So kicho is his spit, or neo is the shnat that comes out of his nose. If a person does damage with them, maybe we'll say that that's a subcategory of a human being. And there is where Rav Papa is saying that their subcategories are not like the primary categories. And where it says, what are you talking about? How can we have damage done by it? If in the manner, if he basically spits it out and that does damage, basically he spits something out and it falls on somebody else's garment and ruins it. Well, that's coming straight from him. And we have a principle that the person's power, anything that comes from him is like his body. And so for sure, it's going to be the same case. V'basar denayach, and if you're going to say he spit it on the floor and then the guy slipped on it and hurt himself, well, bein l'Rab, bein l'Shmuel, hainu bor. That's for sure the case of the pit, because person for sure declared it ownerless, and so therefore, according to everybody, it's a pit. So we must say tawada demave kamave. So we're going to say that the subcategories of mave, of either a Shane according to Shmuel or human according to Rav, they're for sure the same as the primary category. So therefore, when Rav Papa says that there are certain tolados that are not like the avos, Rav Papa, a tolado de eish. Rav Papa says this about fire. So the Gemara says tolado de eish ma'niya. What's a subcategory of fire? Because eish is the last category listed in the Mishnah, havara. So what's a subcategory of fire? If you want to say, let's say he left his stone or his knife or his burden on the rooftop, and then a wind came along and blew it and it fell into the other person's property and did damage, viziko. Well, what's the scenario here? If you want to say, if it did the damage while it was flying through the air, that's fire. Why is it any different than fire? Fire has a different energy associated with it, and it's also your money. It's your money, and you have to watch it. Also, this fire, also this, let's say, knife on your rooftop. You have a wind coming along. It's a different element mixed in, and you're responsible for it. Ella must be that the subcategory of fire is like fire. Papa. So now we have to go back. So we've established all four things. The subcategories are like it. So we go back to the very beginning, going back to shore, to ox. And one of the three aspects of ox is regel, is foot. And we're going to say that when Rav Papa says there's some subcategories that are not like the primary categories, it's a tolada de regel. It's the subcategory of foot. But didn't we say that what is foot? That foot is where you're trampling in the, what did we say was the subcategory of foot? We said in the beginning of today's daf that tawada the regular is where you do damage with your body by walking, or when the ox is damaged by walking, or if it's hair, or if it's saddle. So ha'okimna tawada the regular. We've already established that the subcategory of foot is like foot. So the Gemara says no. What we're talking about here is bechatzi nezek tzroros. Here we're talking about a case where the animal was walking and it kicked up pebbles, and the pebbles then landed on somebody else's property and did damage. And we're talking about there we say that the pebbles, we have a principle that the damages that are done by the pebbles is not like foot where you pay full damages, but in this case it's half damages. It's where you pay half damages in the case of the pebbles. We have a law from Moshe at Sinai that if your animal does damage through pebbles, you only pay half damages. So if that's the case, so if it's not the same as foot, my correlate to the regular. Why is it called a subcategory of foot? So the Gemara says, okay, because we say l'shalem min ha'aliyah. So it's like foot in that the payment is similar. That if you gored with a tom, if the animal gores with an ox that's tom that had never gored before, then you're limited to the damage that was done to the animal. But in this case, like basically, so in this case, however, you pay from the aliyah, meaning to say from all the possessions of the one who does the damage. So in this case, even if you did more damage and the ox was worth, then you have to pay from all of your assets. Whereas in the case of the Karen, then you're limited to the value of the ox itself. So here you have to pay from an aliyah from all your assets, even if it's more than the animal is worth. Mar says, "Vami buy Rava, to buy Rava," but Rava wants to ask this question. Chatzi nezek troros migufa o mishalim o min aliyah mishalim. Rava wants to ask the question: do you pay these half damages from the animal or from all of your assets? So the Gemara says, "Rava mi buy Rav Papa pshita." Rava wasn't sure, but Rav Papa was sure. Rava de mi buy. So therefore, Rav Papa was sure that in this case you don't pay like regal, you pay from the aliyah. So you don't pay like Karen, but you pay like the regal from the aliyah. So the Gemara says, "Well, Rava de mibayle and my correlate to the regal." According to Rava, who's not sure if the churros is paid like the regal or if it's paid like the goring, the Karen. So why does it call the Tolada de regal? The Gemara says, I'll tell you why Rava says that it's going to be considered a Tolada de regal. Just like regal, you're a faux Aradim. Just like regal, if the walking happens in the public domain, you're exempt. So too, if the tzoros, if the pebbles were kicked up and it ruins your car, but your car is in the public domain, you're going to be exempt. So now the Gemara goes back and asks the question. The third one of the primary categories listed in our Mishnah, it says shor, bor, mave, however. The third one is mave. So the Gemara says, my mave. What is mave? Rav Amar mave ze adam. Rav says mave is a damage done by a human. Shmuel Amar mave ze ashen. Shmuel says that mave is a damage done by a tooth. So the Gemara says Rav Amar mave ze adam. Rav says that mave is a damage done by a human. Dichsev Amar shomer asa. Boker v'gam laila im tivayun be'ayu shuvu asayu. This is from the verse from Isaiah, and it means that God said He is the guardian of Israel. Asa, He says, the morning has come, meaning to say, I'm going to bring redemption for the righteous, and I'll also bring upon it night. And this will be im tivayun ba'ayu, if you request forgiveness and you repent. So we see ba'ayu means about a person who's requesting something. So maveh means a person. Shmuel Amar Maveh Zashen. Shmuel says Maveh is tooth because it says Ech nechpasu Esav niv'u matzpunav. In Ovadia it says Ech nechpasu Esav niv'u matzpunav. My mashma. How do we know that it means a tooth? Commentarium Rav Yosef Echtin ispalesh Esav iskalion matmorai. How can the enemies of Esav search all the places where he's hiding and uncover all of his hidden treasures? So we see niv'u means to uncover. And so to a tooth, it's called that because sometimes it's covered and sometimes it's uncovered. Rav, my time Amar Shmuel. Why does Rav not say like Shmuel that it means a tooth? Because Amrlei Mikotani Nive, because the Mishnah doesn't say Nive. It says Mave. Shmuel, my time Amar Rav. Why doesn't Shmuel say it's a person? Amrcha Mikotani Boa. So Michti cry lo kamar daiki my Rav my time lo kamar. So since the pasuk cannot be read both ways, why doesn't Rav say it's like Shmuel? It's a tooth. It says Tana shor v'kol miwe de shor. He says because it already says ox, and ox includes tooth. Ushmuel nami al Tana le shor. So why doesn't what's Shmuel's problem with that? I'm Rav Yehuda Tana shor lekarno umave leshino. So he says it says shor to refer to the goring of the ox, and mava to refer to the tooth of the ox. So the Gemara is going to say, well, if that's the case, it should also say regal. The Gemara is going to ask that later on. But Bava Kamma, and we're going to pick this up, God willing, tonight, and tomorrow we'll take this Gemara up. Yashikov to everyone. We'll stop the recording here.